Hey everybody, it's Theo Vaughn here, and I got a question. When it comes to soda, are you really picking a zero sugar cola that you actually prefer, or are you just settling for what you've always had? That's the question. And I'll say this, when it comes to taste, I find that nothing beats Pepsi Zero Sugar. But you don't just have to take my word for it. That would be ridiculous. Pepsi has been doing blind taste tests for years. No labels, no brand names, just taste. And last year, they brought back the Pepsi Challenge, and the results were clear. 66% of people agreed and said that Pepsi Zero Sugar tastes better than Coca-Cola Zero Sugar. In fact, Pepsi Zero Sugar won in every market they tested. So if you're grabbing a zero sugar soda, go with the one people keep choosing when taste is the only thing that matters. Go out and try Pepsi Zero Sugar today. Let your taste decide.
In Germany, there lived a man who was obsessed with blood, like legitimately. Today's story is about a man who believed he was a vampire, though you ain't gonna see any of that usual sexy vampire shit in this episode, which, funnily enough, is about a man known as the king of sexual perverts.
Nice.
Hey you and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old podcast, it's time for Peter Kurten, the man, the murders, and lots of blood. So look forward to that. The city of Dusseldorf is a major economic hub in Western Germany. Buildings in the city date back as far as the 13th century. But we ain't going back that far today. We're going to the last days of the 19th century and the earliest of the 20th to look at a man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Peter Kurten was what's known as a hemomaniac. That means he had an obsession with blood, and just like many with singular psychological conditions, the vast majority of those who are diagnosed are completely harmless to themselves and others. The problem comes when specific conditions are combined with certain personality types and other psychological disorders. In Kurten's case, his obsession with the old crimson was pathological, aka clinical vampirism, aka Renfield's syndrome. Essentially, he was as close to being a real-life vampire as it is possibly to be, just without all the supernatural shit around it, which is kind of like the cooler shit. So he's sort of just like a fucking loser who's obsessed with blood. Spoiler alert, but we'll get into all of that. And we'll also be talking about, well, he committed a lot, and I mean like a lot of murders. Peter Kurten was born on May 26, 1883 in Mulheim am Rhein in Cologne. He would end up being joined by a further 12 siblings, though 2 of them would die at an extremely young age. The family lived in what can only be described as the definition of abject poverty. Along with their 2 parents, both of whom were serious and well-practiced alcoholics, the family squeezed themselves into a 1-bedroom apartment. Rather than channeling his energy into fighting to lift his family out of the mud, Kurten's father had long ago surrendered himself to the daily grind of a life in poverty, only alleviating his own pain by making sure his wife and children suffer more than he did. It's like, you know the saying, there's always somebody worse off than yourself? Well, Peter's father, he made sure that was true, and those people worse off than himself were his wife and kids. Not only would he regularly beat his family and children, whether he had a reason to or not, but his abuse was also sexual too. It got so bad, and listen folks, we're not in the late 1800s, so in those days it had to be really bad for authorities to, actually do something. He would eventually be jailed for 18 months in 1897 for repeatedly assaulting one of his own daughters, the eldest, who was 13 at the time of his imprisonment. The prison sentence gave Peter's mother the perfect chance to get away for good, and that's exactly what she did do. After obtaining a separation order, she took the family to Dusseldorf and remarried. Peter would follow in his father's footsteps towards his siblings, however, and Peter's own assaults on siblings and schoolmates didn't stop after his father's imprisonment. In 1888, 5-year-old Peter was involved in a horrific incident in which he apparently nearly drowned another boy in his class, and it wouldn't be the last time he'd attempt to drown a classmate. By 1892, young Peter had become friendly with a local man whose job it was to catch stray dogs in the city limits. Now this lovely old fella taught Peter the ropes of the job, but also taught him something a little more extracurricular, how to torture innocent and helpless animals. And together, they would do just that. As part of his ongoing efforts to escape the violence of his home life, Peter would spend a lot of time wandering the streets, and it didn't take long for him to begin mixing with some of the most unsavory types among the homeless community. Through those connections, Peter quickly learned that there were alternative ways to make money, cha-ching, outside of working to death in a factory, or the few other options to make a meager wage, slaving away until you died. Sadly, though, this is not the story of, this anti-hero's glamorous rise up through the criminal ranks to a better life. No, that's not the type of story we're telling here. You probably guessed. Peter began his criminal career by stealing and thieving from shops and stores, and anyone unfortunate enough who crossed his path. If Peter's own account of his early life is to be believed, his long list of murder victims also began before he was even 10 years old. Peter, he would claim that when he was 9 years of age, himself and a few other boys from his school were rafting when Peter decided to shove one of the other boys, who he knew could not swim, off the raft and into the freezing river. Another boy attempted to save the flailing child, but also ended up succumbing to the freezing water. So, yeah, even at age 9 here, folks, Peter, the value of life for him was a big fat 0. Animal or human, he didn't give a shite, right? Worse, he enjoyed it. He enjoyed inflicting pain and distress on others. The list of Kurten's victims, both confirmed and suspected, folks, it's a hell of a long one. At least 24 names long, including men, women, and children. He is one of, we're gonna get into it all now, folks, one of the most sadistic and cruel killers that you probably haven't heard about. Around 1896, when Peter was aged 13, he engaged in a relationship with a girl the same age as himself. And it was with her that he experimented with his sexuality for the first time. They would kiss and cuddle, but she flat out refused to go any further because, probably the fact that she was fucking 13 had something to do with it, which left Peter deeply frustrated. So lacking any sort of impulse control, as he was, Peter was completely unable to deal with those feelings. In order to deal with his urges, Peter, folks, sometimes even I'm surprised by the shit I come out with and have to say in these, episodes. So Peter, he resorted to bestiality and having intercourse with various animals, including sheep and pigs. And if that wasn't bad enough, he later confessed that it wasn't even the sexual assault on the animals that, got his rocks off, but instead it was only when he stabbed or cut the animal while he was having sex with it that he could el busto. Lads, fucking hell, I can't believe I have to say this shit. In 1897, shortly before his father was imprisoned, he demanded Peter leave school and find paying work instead, leading to Peter taking up an apprenticeship as a molder. The daily grind of actual hard labor, not for our lad Peter though, and through 2 years into his apprenticeship, he would suddenly do a legger, taking with him every single penny he could find in the family home, and another 300 marks, from his employer. So flush with cash, he absconded along the Rhine to the city of Koblenz. And in Koblenz, aged 16 now, he hooked up with an 18-year-old sex worker. For the first time, he had someone to indulge him in his most intimate and, let's be honest folks, depraved fantasies. His teenage rampage lasted a little over a month, ending when he was arrested, and he copped 2 charges of breaking and entering and theft. Fortunately for him, the courts took pity on him being so young, and not having yet compiled the long history of run-ins with the law that he later would compile. He'll have a hell of a record. He got off just lightly with a month in prison, being released in 1899. He quickly showed that prison had taught him nothing at all, and set about adding to his list of crimes achieved and racking up those wanted points. He didn't hang about either, later claiming that he'd committed his first murder the same year he was released. That November, 1899, Peter claimed to have met a young girl, around 18 years of age, who he persuaded to go with him to the city park, where the two of them had sex before he strangled the girl unconscious. He fled the scene, believing he had killed the girl, but no records of a young girl, or anyone else, being killed in the area at that time have been found to exist. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Peter Kurten was lying about murdering this person, but maybe he had just been mistaken in his belief that he killed the girl and she actually survived and just never reported what happened. Either way, Kurten had learned something about himself that would motivate his crimes going forward. He got a greater sexual thrill from believing he had killed the girl. The next year, in 1900, Kurten was twice arrested again, this time on suspicion of fraud. It was deemed enough to warrant a more serious sentence of 4 years in prison. Now, the sentence returned Peter to Dusseldorf for the first time since he'd fled with his pockets full of cash in 1899. He served his sentence before being released in 1904. And shortly after, Peter found himself a new hobby: arson. Don't you just love it? Once again, his motivation, according to a later confession years later, was his own perverse sexual excitement at the prospect. It just gave him a huge chubby, the idea of burning people alive, which, it's hard to think of a more messed up sentence than that one, but I'm sure I'll come up with it. Kurten admitted to setting around 24 fires, mostly targeting barns and places like that, places where homeless were more than likely trying to find a safe night's sleep. He would end up spending a decade in prison for that one. Once again, just as he had in 1904, in 1913, no sooner had Peter's feet hit the streets as a free man, and he was back to committing crimes once again. What are the odds of that one? Short on options to make a living, it wasn't a shock to anyone that he went back to stealing, but what is utterly inexcusable is a crime he committed in May 1913 in Cologne during a burglary of a pub. This time, the crime would be very much recorded in contemporary news and police reports. On May 25th, 1913, 9-year-old Christine Klein was asleep in one of the rooms on the second floor when Peter Kurten had broken in and he discovered her. Without even thinking twice, he put his hands around the little girl's throat and began squeezing violently. Christine, she woke up and briefly tried to fight free but quickly succumbed to unconsciousness. With the young girl completely vulnerable and at his mercy, Peter lifted her head, took his small pocket knife out, and sliced the girl's throat. He then left the place, locking the door behind him, and departed for Dusseldorf immediately after. However, he would return to Cologne, where he committed the crime, the very next day, very deliberately choosing to drink at a bar opposite the inn where he murdered Christine the night before. Literally so he could indulge himself in the local patrons talking about the horrific crime that had just happened the previous night. He would later claim to have gotten a thrill from hearing their discussions and, their abhorrence of the crime. And that was almost as rewarding to him as the act of killing itself. After Christine was buried, he would continue to haunt the little girl, sporadically traveling to her grave. The murder of Christine had opened the floodgates, and the last of any semblance of morality buried deep in Peter Kurten was washed away in a flood of blood. 2 months on from Christine's murder, Peter's first confirmed kill as an adult, he would once again come across a vulnerable young girl while committing a burglary. This time, the unfortunate, about-to-be victim was 17-year-old Gertrude Franken. He strangled the girl until she coughed up blood, which he claimed caused him to, how do you put this lightly, bust on sight. He fled immediately after. Now, Peter wasn't a suspect in either Christine's murder or the attempted murder of Gertrude Franken, but he still found himself quickly back in handcuffs a few days after for another spat of arson fires, burglaries, and break-ins. He ended up doing another 8 years for that. Upon his release back into a very different society in April 1921, post-World War I, Kurten first lived with one of his sisters for a short time, and it was through his sister that Peter met the owner of a local sweet shop named August Scharf. Scharf hadn't exactly had it easy in life. A former sex worker, she also had a body on her record, having been convicted of shooting and killing her previous husband. Over the space of around 2 years, Peter wormed his way into her life by pretending to be a former prisoner of war, eventually marrying her, but the two had been sleeping together for a long time before the union was officially official. Now, the marriage to Scharf, it actually seemed to have a positive impact on Peter. Somehow, at least initially, despite being a loner and isolating himself socially, Peter began working a legitimate job and even bothered to turn up to work as a trade union official. This lasted until 1925, when he upped sticks and took his wife Scharf back to his hometown of Dusseldorf. And, folks, if you can believe it, in a shock to absolutely no one, Peter began cheating on his wife right away, with both a household maid named Mek and a servant girl named Tidi, something which his wife, August Scharf, was naturally furious to discover. And the whole infidelity gig of Peter Kurten cheating on his wife, it exploded into chaos when August Scharf found out what her husband had been up to. And when she did, both the women he claimed to have been, having affairs with, Mek and Titi, they both went to the police, each claiming the affairs hadn't exactly been voluntary on their parts, if you know what I'm saying. And back to prison he went. However, he did remain married to Auguste, and she will pop up later in this story. An initial 8-month sentence was reduced to 6, upon the condition that Peter leave the city of Dusseldorf, something he agreed to, but later successfully fought to have reversed. So no longer satisfied by merely fantasizing, Peter's next victim was a middle-aged woman named Apollonia Kuhn, who he followed and stalked until the opportunity came for him to grab her as she walked out of view of others. Grabbing the shocked and terrified woman by the collar of her coat, Peter dragged her into nearby undergrowth. With his horrified victim exactly where he wanted, Peter pulled out a pair of scissors he had sharpened specifically for this occasion, a weapon that would become Peter's signature tool throughout the first phase of his assault on the people of Dusseldorf. He proceeded to launch into a frenzied stabbing attack. 24 times he plunged the scissors into Kuhn's flesh. Some of the wounds were so deep that they cut through muscle, fat, and sinew, and only stopped after hitting bone. Peter fled, leaving his victim for dead. Some fucking hell, by the way. Apollonia Kuhn survived the attack, but could not remember anything of her attacker to try and catch who had done it. The attack on Kuhn took place February 3rd, 1929, and it was the first of a 2-year-long rampage across Dusseldorf that would hold the city in terror. No one was safe. Men, women, children, it was all the same to Peter. All he wanted was to see blood flow, and he was prepared to do anything to get it. And I do mean anything. The next one gets even more grim, folks, so hold on to your butts. Only 5 days after the attack on Apollonia Kuhn, on February 8, 1929, Peter Kurten struck again. This time, the victim was a 9-year-old girl named Rosa Ohlinger. What he did to this innocent young girl is truly sickening. He grabbed the girl up and strangled her until she was unconscious. And with the same scissors he used to stab Kuhn, he did the same to Rosa, stabbing her in the stomach and genitals. The killing blow was the thrust of the scissors into her temple and penetrating her skull. Peter made a very half-assed effort to hide the girl's body from view by dragging it underneath a hedgerow while he went to go get kerosene, which he returned with later and set the body on fire. The burned remains of Rosa Ohlinger were discovered the very next day. The 5-day gap between killing Ohlinger and Kuhn's attempted murder became a pattern when, on February 13th, 1929, he struck again, proving that he would kill everyone and anyone that he could, regardless of age, race, creed, or gender. Peter's next target, it was a 45-year-old male mechanic named Rudolf Scheer. The attack was just as brutal and nasty as the previous two. Scheer had been stabbed around 20 times in total, suffering wounds all over his body and head. The majority of the wounds were to Scheer's back, suggesting that he had likely been taken by surprise. Once he was subdued though, Peter got up close and stabbed the man on the ground in the eyes. Once again, the very next day, Kurten returned to the scene of the crime to revel in what he had done. The 3 attacks all took place in the same area, so that, along with the similarities in the wounds sustained by the victims, it was enough for detectives to overlook the differences in their genders and ages, and to treat the 3 crimes, 2 murders and 1 attempted, as possibly being related. It was also discerned early on in the investigation that, lacking any obvious motive for the killings, like robbery or something like that, coupled with the apparently randomly selected victims, that indicated to detectives whoever had done this, infliction of pain and death was the killer's only motivation. Now, Peter wouldn't strike again until August 11th, 1929, but he would later claim to have attempted to kill 4 women between March and July of that year in strangulation attacks. However, the 4th overall confirmed murder and the last of the scissors phase of the spree, a young woman named Maria Hahn, was as astonishingly cruel as any murder could be. Kurten took advantage of Hahn's trust when he invited the young girl on a date on a Sunday. As soon as he had her alone in a meadow, Kurten dropped the pretense of the date and coldly attacked the unexpecting woman. He first assaulted, then strangled and stabbed Hahn. Hahn lingered, clinging to life for almost an hour after the attack. once dead. In an effort to stop his wife hearing about a murder and connecting it to his bloody clothes she would inevitably discover, Kurt buried Hans' mutilated body in a cornfield. He hadn't forgotten, though, what he had done. He would later return to Hans' burial site and excavate the body with a horrifying plan in mind. Kurten wanted to disturb people and saw an opportunity to do so with Hans' body. The plan had been to pin her decomposed corpse to a tree in a crucifixion pose. Only the little issue was Kurten. He was a bit of a bitch. He couldn't lift the slight remains of Han, so instead of this big old picture he wanted to do, this grotesque tableau, Kurten settled for taking the body back to the grave where he lay under the rotted remains to extract some more sick pleasure from it before he reburied Han's body. And he would continue to visit the burial site and tend to it for almost 3 months after the murder and crucifixion attempts. Not out of any sense of guilt, as you can imagine, but purely out of the excitement he would get from knowing her corpse was there. 2 months after killing her, Kurten sent a confession letter to police, describing Hans' murder and where he had buried the body. A month later, he sent another, more detailed letter that included a map to exactly where she was found. Hans' remains were discovered in the field November 15th, 1929. Peter Kurten's next assault was another crime of opportunity. Rather than the planned attack like Han had been, he spotted 14-year-old Louise and her 5-year-old foster sister Gertrude just as they were leaving the fair. He tailed the pair, and as they passed through allotments by the fairground on their way home, he cut them off and persuaded Louise to go and buy him cigarettes in return for 20 pennies. As soon as she was gone, Kurten strangled 5-year-old Gertrude. When she lost consciousness, he cut her throat and tossed her body into a patch of beans growing in one of the allotments. He then waited for the older girl to return. When she did, Kurten attacked, choking her, before launching into a frenzied stabbing attack. Footprints at the scene indicated that the girl had possibly tried to run away, but had collapsed from her wounds. Kurten cut the doomed girl's throat, slashing it twice, before he bit into her wound and sucked blood from the gushing stab wound. The next day, after the murders of 2 children, Kurten brazenly and randomly propositioned a 27-year-old housemaid named Gertrude Schultz. When Schultz rejected him, Kurten handled it incredibly well. Sort of. By that I mean, totally not really. Screaming at her, "Well, die then!" He then pulled a knife and stabbed her multiple times in the head and neck, continuing to stab her in the back and shoulder as she tried desperately to get away. Now, this Gertrude Schultz would pull through and survive her injuries, but, it's not exactly something you get over. Sadly, though, Gertrude, she couldn't remember much about this attacker, other than assuming he was around 40 years old. That had just been completely random. From the September 30th, 1929 point on, he would adopt his third and final weapon of choice. At Dusseldorf station, Kurten turned on charms and managed to lure a 31-year-old servant girl named Ida Rauder into leaving the safety of the station and going with him to a cafe and a walk through the park along the river. Of course, it was all a ploy for Kurten to get the girl's trust enough to be alone with him. Once they were isolated from public view, Kurten subjected the girl to an assault as sudden as it was brutal. He hit the vulnerable girl multiple times in the head with his new weapon of choice, a hammer. After Rauder regained consciousness and begged Kurten to stop and to let her live, all he did was give her more hammer blows to the head, and as he said, quote, misuse her. 11 days after that murder, Kurten repeated his definitely not a psycho killer routine for Elizabeth Dorrier, a 22-year-old servant girl. The final deadly attack of Kurten's spree came November 7th, 1929. The victim was just 5 years old. Kurten was able to persuade little Gertrude Alberman into following him into some vacant lots, where he choked the girl unconscious. Once she was completely defenseless, Kurten used his original weapon, the sharpened scissors, to stab the girl 35 times. He then tossed her butchered body into a pile of nettles and fled. Kurten later sent a local paper an anonymous confession letter, providing details of the crime, and Kurten had included precise directions to where he'd left 5-year-old Alberman's body, including a description of how he'd positioned the body face down and the rubble around it. Although he couldn't have known that her body had already been found the same day the paper received that confession letter. By late 1929, authorities were obviously under enormous pressure from the public, not just localized in Dusseldorf, but on a national scale. The murders had caught the entire country's attention. Everybody had heard about the monster stalking men, women, and children. The reality of Kurten's crimes was already so shockingly brutal that no embellishment was needed. Yet naturally, with each recounting, the story gained some small changes and exaggerations. The vampire of Dusseldorf had become a boogeyman for the whole of Germany, which, given this all happened within the context of, this period of Germany, that's how much of an impact he had. Behind the scenes, though, investigators were far more perplexed by the crimes than they could afford to admit. At first, Kurten's attempt to confuse any potential investigation into suspecting multiple killers were at work, well, it actually worked on police. The switch up in weapons and the wide range of victims threw detectives off the single killer track. The list of potential suspects was enormous, and without DNA or any other modern forensic testing to quickly rule names off the list, the investigation was terrifyingly daunting, to say the least. As each new article came out and drip-read information on the vampire's latest atrocity, the paranoia and suspicion among the public was elevated to panic levels. People began reporting on acquaintances, close friends, family members. Between somewhere in the region of 13,000 letters from the public and traditional investigative techniques, well, that had given the police a list of suspects that was closing in on 1 million names. That's a lot of interviews to get cracking on. It was the confession letters, however, which were examined by a handwriting expert. That's how they were determined to have been written by the same person. Not only did it link the writer to the scenes, it connected the crimes to one another. And so, for the first time, detectives were able to say they were looking for a single perpetrator in the series of murders that had rocked the country. By early 1930, Kurten was unknowingly up against the full force of the nation's best investigators, who had unlimited manpower and funds at their disposal, along with the pressure of both the German public spheres and their government's expectations at their backs. All they needed was for Kurten to make the right kind of mistake that would reveal a vital clue about his identity. In the end, he gave them more than they could have ever hoped for. Kurten had become complacent, frighteningly so. After the murder in November 1929, Kurten was quiet over the Christmas period. When he eventually struck up again, though, he did so in the most chaotic and lackadaisical way possible. Throughout February, March, and May of 1930, Kurten, having gotten himself a brand spanking new hammer, attacked 10 separate victims with a combination of blunt force strikes and strangulation. The difference between these latest attacks and all of those up to the murder of Gertrude Alberman was that not only did Kurten fail to finish any of them off, he also let many of them see his face very clearly. He'd also claimed that during this time, he caught and decapitated a swan before drinking its blood from its neck, which caused him to spontaneously bust. The key witness that would turn it all around for the vampire investigation was a 20-year-old woman named Maria Budlik. A seemingly friendly stranger had approached Maria at a Dusseldorf station and managed to get her talking enough that she revealed to the stranger, she had just come from Cologne in search of lodgings and work. That was the opening this man needed. He told Maria he just so happened to know of a hostel that would provide her the perfect accommodation, and that he might be able to help her find a job too. He kindly offered to show the desperate young lady to the hostel, an offer she naively accepted. It was a step-by-step walk through the recognizable moves from Kurten's playbook. And it was on the way that Maria realized something wasn't quite right. Her guide seemed overly keen on getting Maria away from other people. Knowing that meant nothing good, Maria refused to allow the man to take her any further, and an argument broke out. Fortunately for Maria, another man passing by saw the argument and intervened, asking Maria if this strange man from the station, was he bothering you? A question to which Maria said yes, or well, probably yeah, maybe. In response to that, her rescuer made quick work of shooing the potential assailant away from her. This new guy then, her savior, he then invited the young lady to come get something to eat and drink at his apartment, and he introduced himself to her as Peter Kurten. Yeah, that's right. Plot twist! The man you thought wasn't the guy at all. It was a different guy! As there are multiple rapist killers here, Lord knows, folks, Lord knows. Apparently Maria, though, she had developed a sixth sense for weirdos because she immediately clicked onto Kurten's underlying motive for wanting to get a vulnerable young woman, one with no connection to anyone in the city and no one to notice she was missing, alone in his apartment. Maria flat out told him that she wasn't interested. It must suck for Maria. She's just arrived from Cologne in Dusseldorf. She's already met two weirdos. Yeah. So when she told Kurten that she wasn't interested, he managed to act shocked at the investigation and explained he's just trying to help. However, Maria, her sixth sense for weirdos abandoned her, and she finally did agree to go with Peter Kurten to a hotel he knew. Instead, though, he took her to an isolated spot in the woods, where he assaulted and attempted to strangle Maria. Kurten had his hand around her throat, but the moment he relaxed his grip, Maria let out a loud scream. The yell was loud enough that Kurten suspected there was no way someone hadn't heard that and would soon be investigating. The scream, coupled with the knowledge that Maria couldn't recall his address, a claim she made while she was begging for her life, Kurten then fled, and Maria Budalik walked away from the encounter alive, horribly scarred by the experience, but alive. It was only thanks to a whim of fate and circumstance that Maria's run-in with the vampire of Dusseldorf would reach authorities. See, Maria didn't go to the police after the attack, but she did write down details of the whole ordeal in a letter she was sending back to her friend in Cologne. Only, however, Maria, sending this letter documenting the attack, she made a vital mistake. She'd written out the address incorrectly, something that meant the letter she was sending to her friend couldn't be delivered, and instead led to the post office clerk, who, in an effort to obtain a return address, opened the letter and read the shocking account of what had been done to her. He subsequently turned the document over to police, and it eventually made its way to detectives investigating the vampire case, who believed that there was a chance, albeit a small one, that this was the man they were hunting. Detectives working on the vampire case were able to track Maria down in Dusseldorf and interview her personally. Throughout the duration of the interview, not only did detectives become convinced that this was the vampire, but they also knew that Maria could help them far more than they had expected. See, as Kurten had been assaulting her, Maria very intelligently told him she wouldn't be able to tell anybody about him because she didn't know where he lived. But Maria did know where he lived, as he had invited her to his apartment at 71 Met Manor Street. She remembered that very well. Detectives, accompanied by Maria, paid a visit to Kurten's lodgings, where his landlady confirmed that he lived there. Detectives actually had come far closer to the vampire that day than they realized, however. Kurten had been returning to the apartment when he saw Maria with police outside his building. Recognizing Maria, Kurten knew that not only did officers now know his address, but they had his name too, and it would be a short time before he was in handcuffs. So whatever he had to do it quickly. Which was, once again, doing a legger, returning to his wife, August. Remember her? The sweet shop owner? On May 23rd, 1930, Kurten returned to his wife once more. But this time, he told August the full and shocking story of who he really was. He was the vampire of Dusseldorf. Rather than asking her, though, to help him avoid capture, he told his wife that she should turn him in and collect the large reward for the vampire's arrest. Now, August's sheriff, she was like, actually, that's a pretty good idea, and she took him up on it, and contacted the police the very next day, explaining to them that her husband had confessed his guilt in the crimes attributed to the vampire of Dusseldorf. Kurten was arrested without resistance when he came to meet August. Kurten's subsequent confessions to the police were as informative for the investigators as they were shocking for the public. Although Kurten claimed guilt in almost 70 crimes, including 31 attempted murders and 9 completed killings, he gave descriptions of all of his murders, which included detailing how, in 1929, he had drunk so much of Maria Hahn's blood it caused him to puke. Kurten also claimed that the motive behind his murders was his desire to see his victims bleed, and the murders were not the point of the crime, but a cover-up of his actual desires. Kurten seemed overly keen to stress that he had never unnecessarily tortured any of his victims, especially not the children, so, he just wants you to know he's not a total monster. Now, there was a lot of debate around the truth of Kurten's claims about his motivations. There was no doubting his guilt, but the reasoning behind it was far from clear-cut. To the public, morally speaking, the why didn't really matter at all. but legally, and to the courts, it did matter a hell of a lot. See, Kurten was extensively examined in the run-up to his trial, and again he stressed throughout that he had been motivated by his pathological desire to see blood in order to receive sexual gratification. Despite his apparent openness though, he did make several errors and contradictions, along with just as many obvious exaggerations in his recounting of the assaults and murders. Kurten did at times slip in his claims for his motivation being entirely driven by bloodlust, claiming on several occasions that he had also been pushed into his crimes by society's treatment of him and the unfairness of the world around him. So which is it? Do you just want to see blood, or you just pour me a pint of blood? Whatever the truth, Kurten was ultimately found fit to face trial, finally coming to the stand in April 1931 in the same city he had terrorized for so long. The trial was almost as chaotic as the assault on Dusseldorf itself. Initially, Kurten entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. To combat this, Kurten's confession was read aloud in the court before the prosecution brought in several experts in psychiatry to testify to Kurten's mental capacity and control over his own actions when the crimes were committed. The consensus from experts was that Kurten was very much legally sane at the time of the killings. Days into his trial, Kurten requested that his defense attorney enter a change of plea to guilty, which he truly did. Kurten admitted before the court that he, in fact, was far from regretting his crimes, and actually, you know what, folks, he looked back fondly on, murdering all the murders and, shit he did. He thought it was great. After 10 days of testimony, the jury just took 2 hours to return a verdict, and it was curtains for Peter. He was sentenced to death on 9 counts of murder. Following a last meal of Wiener Schnitzel, fried potatoes, and a bottle of white wine, Kurten walked to the chopping block at Kingelputz prison in Cologne with the blood of dozens on his hands. It was July 1st, 1931. And this is sort of weird and kind of funny, but more so weird. His pathological love of blood, it ran so deep that he was genuinely excited for the moment the executioner's axe came down and severed his head from his neck. Because, yeah, by the way, that's how he's going to be killed. Beheaded with an axe. He claimed that the prospect of hearing his own blood spurt from the wound, just as the last neurons fired and died, it excited him more than any of the kills that had brought him here. On his final walk, Kurten asked the prison psychiatrist, quote, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures."
Okay.
Lord knows what he heard. Following his execution, Kurten's head was dissected and mummified, with his brain being extracted to be examined for abnormalities that could explain his personality and behavior. Both these exams and his autopsy revealed he had no physical conditions or abnormalities, outside of an enlarged thymus gland, which would have had no effect on his homicidal tendencies. After the conclusion of World War II, Kurten's preserved head was taken to the United States, where it currently remains. Folks, if you would like to see the severed head of this serial killer, you can, if you can believe it, for the price of a plane ticket to Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin, and entry to Ripley's Believe It or Not. And that'll do it for this whole episode, folks. That is the story of the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Probably one of the most sick, perverse killers I think I've covered. Although I feel like I say that a lot, and I'm always kind of surprised by how actually dark and disturbing these. Like every time you think, you covered the most sick and disturbing killer, another one comes out, and you're like, oh, for fuck's sake. Thanks for listening, folks. Talk to you soon. Love ya. Bye.
This episode is brought to you by Greenlight. You can't solve every case for your kids, but with Greenlight, they'll have the instincts and money skills to stay out of trouble. With a Greenlight debit card and money app, parents can monitor spending and teach financial responsibility. Educate your kids as they grow, from earning allowance and tracking chores to learning how to save and invest. Start your risk-free Greenlight trial today at greenlight.com/Spotify.